Some feelings arrive quietly, like a breeze through an open window. You hardly notice until the room feels different. I never planned to live with my uncle. If you had asked me a year ago where I'd be at 22, I would have said something like, finishing my final design portfolio, probably in a cramped apartment with noisy neighbors and a cat I didn't have time to name. But life doesn't always follow the script. It finds a way to thrill us, tease us, if you know what I mean. Instead, I found myself in a quiet countryside home, surrounded by pine trees and silence that stretched for miles. The house didn't hum with city noise or the clatter of a nearby highway. It breathed. Every creak in the floorboards, every rustling branch against the window, it all felt alive, peaceful, still. It was supposed to be temporary. My name is Elena Reyes, and I moved in with my uncle Marcus and his wife Celeste after my mom accepted a research position overseas. There wasn't time to plan much, and Marcus was the only family nearby willing to take me in while I finished my last semester of college. I thought I'd be here for a few months, finish school, save some money, and move on. But something changed. Not outside. The house, the trees, the routine, they all stayed the same. It was inside me, and it had something to do with Marcus. He wasn't a typical uncle figure. He never treated me like a child, even when I was one. He taught me how to change a tire, helped me submit my first scholarship application, and once drove 3 hours just to sit through my high school art exhibit. He was present in the way most people only pretend to be. I admired him. I always had. But admiration has a way of evolving, quietly and without permission. The first time I noticed it, it was nothing. A glance held a moment too long. A breath that caught when I realized we were alone in the kitchen. The soft sound of a spoon stirring tea, the only noise between us. Harmless things. Things you could brush off. Still, I felt it. Marcus's wife, Celeste, was kind but distant. She was one of those people who spoke in curated sentences, like her emotions had been edited for clarity. We got along fine, but we weren't close. She spent most of her time in town, working at the Historical Society and volunteering at the community garden on weekends. I often found myself alone with Marcus in the evenings. He'd sit at the long oak dining table, reading or scrolling through recipes he'd never try. I'd be on the couch nearby, sketching. Occasionally, we'd talk, but more often, we didn't. We just shared space, until it didn't feel like just space anymore. One night, I caught him watching me. Not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but in a way that made me wonder what he was thinking. His eyes lingered, not on my face or hands or anything specific, but like he was seeing something he wasn't sure he should be seeing. When our eyes met, he looked away quickly, cleared his throat, and asked something ordinary like, "How's your project coming?" But his voice was rougher than usual, like something lived just beneath it. I told myself I was imagining it. Still, I started noticing more. The way his hand would rest on my shoulder a second longer when he passed behind me. The way he seemed to listen more closely when I laughed. The way his expression softened when he looked at me, as if he were remembering something, or maybe forgetting something else. It was subtle, unspoken, but it made everything feel heavier. I tried to keep things normal, focused on my classes, my freelance work, the digital illustrations I was submitting to a few local galleries. But the stillness of the house made it hard to ignore the shift. The quiet had a shape now. It pressed in around me, making me feel like I was waiting for something to happen, even though I didn't know what. One Saturday afternoon, Marcus helped me carry a broken printer down to the garage. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary. But when he reached to take it from me, our hands touched, just for a second. His thumb grazed the inside of my wrist and lingered. It was barely a moment, but I felt it. A spark of something that didn't belong. He didn't say anything, just took the printer and walked ahead. But I stood there for a few seconds longer than I needed to, staring at the spot where our hands had met, wondering what it meant. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the wind in the trees and the occasional creak of footsteps in the hallway. I wondered if he felt it too, or if this was just me, misreading everything like some lonely, restless girl desperate for connection. The next morning, he made breakfast like nothing had happened. "Do you want toast?" he asked, holding up a slice. I nodded, watching his hands as he reached for the butter. They were strong hands, capable, familiar. But now, they felt like a question I didn't know how to answer. We sat down across from each other at the table, the toast between us. Celeste was out for the day, helping with a local art fair. We talked about the weather, my classes, his plans to repaint the porch, but the air between us was filled with everything we didn't say. After breakfast, I retreated to my room, pretending to work on a design brief. I stared at my laptop screen, unmoving. My heart felt like it was holding its breath. I didn't know what was happening. Not really. I wasn't trying to feel this way. I wasn't chasing anything. But the way Marcus looked at me sometimes, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he didn't want to finish, it made me wonder if he was feeling it too. And if he was, what then? I closed my laptop and turned toward the window. The sky was soft and gray, the kind of gray that made the trees look like watercolor. I knew something had shifted. I just didn't know where it would lead. But I did know this. The house wasn't just quiet anymore. It was charged. Like a current ran through the walls, waiting for someone to touch the switch. And maybe, just maybe, I already had. The days blurred into a kind of quiet rhythm. Mornings began with the smell of coffee and the sound of birds outside the kitchen window. Evenings ended with warm lights, soft footsteps in the hallway, and the low hum of Marcus's voice talking about repairs or some new recipe he wanted to try but never did. It should have felt peaceful, but it didn't. Not entirely. There was something beneath the surface now, a tension that hummed just low enough that no one could name it, but high enough that I felt it in the pit of my stomach. I started spending more time in the studio space Marcus had cleared out for me at the back of the house. It used to be a storage room, but now it was filled with my sketchbooks, digital tablet, and a small desk with uneven legs. The window overlooked the garden, where Celeste had planted rows of lavender and basil. It was my hideaway, a space where I could draw, think, and avoid the strange weight settling over my chest whenever Marcus was near. Still, I couldn't help noticing when he passed by the doorway. Sometimes he'd pause, just for a second. He'd glance in, offer a smile, and ask, "Need anything?" "No, I'm okay," I'd reply, pretending to focus on my screen. But after he walked away, I'd catch myself staring at the empty doorway, wondering what he was thinking, wondering what I was thinking. The truth was, I didn't know how to feel. I wasn't sure where admiration ended and something else began. I wasn't even sure if anything had begun at all. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I was just grasping at closeness in a house that felt too big for 3 people who barely spoke about anything real. One rainy afternoon, I found myself sitting in the living room with Marcus. Celeste was out again, this time meeting with a group of artists organizing a fundraiser for the town's restoration project. Marcus had been working on a leaky faucet earlier, and now he was flipping through a home repair magazine that looked like it hadn't been updated since 2004. I was curled up in the armchair by the window, sketchbook open on my lap. I wasn't drawing anything in particular, just lines, shapes, the start of a figure I didn't finish. "You've gotten better," he said suddenly, his voice low but clear. I looked up. "At what?" "Drawing," he said, tapping a page I hadn't realized he could see. "You used to rush through your lines. Now they breathe." I blinked. It was a strange compliment, and yet it made my chest tighten. "Thanks," I murmured, closing the sketchbook slowly. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You ever think about illustrating full-time, making stories come to life?" "All the time," I said, smiling slightly. "But I'm not sure where to start." "You'll figure it out," he said, with a quiet certainty that made me want to believe him. I studied his face, just for a moment. There were lines around his eyes I hadn't noticed before. His hair was starting to gray at the temples. He looked tired, but in a way that made him seem more real. He looked up, and our eyes met. Neither of us looked away immediately. I don't know how long we held that gaze. 2, maybe 3 seconds. just long enough for my skin to warm, for the air to feel heavier than it had a moment ago. Then he cleared his throat and turned back to the magazine. I didn't open my sketchbook again. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the rain tapped softly against the windows. I kept thinking about the way he looked at me. It wasn't inappropriate. Well, not exactly. But it wasn't uncle-like either. It was something else. Something I couldn't name without feeling guilty. The next morning, I found a note on the kitchen table. Marcus had gone to town for supplies. Celeste was still asleep. I made coffee and sat in the quiet, wondering why my heart felt like it was balancing on the edge of something I didn't fully understand. Later that week, everything came to a strange kind of head. It was a Thursday evening. Celeste had been called away for an overnight work retreat at the museum, something about cataloging new artifacts. Marcus and I had dinner alone, grilled vegetables, rice, and a salad I'd made from the garden. After dinner, I offered to help clean up. He waved me off. "You cooked," he said, smiling. "I'll handle this." I stood at the counter, drying dishes as he washed. We worked in silence, the kind that felt full rather than awkward. Every so often, our hands would brush. I tried not to flinch, but each touch felt like it left a mark. "Do you miss your mom?" he asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard. "Sometimes," I said honestly. "We were never very close, but I miss the idea of her." He nodded. "I get that." "Do you?" I asked softly, turning to look at him. Marcus's hands stilled in the water. He looked up, eyes unreadable. "More than you know." Something passed between us then. Not words, just a charge in the air, a flicker of recognition. Like we were both standing on the same ledge, unsure of what was on the other side. I looked away first. We finished the dishes in silence. As I turned to leave the kitchen, I felt his eyes on me again. Not in a way that made me feel preyed upon, but in a way that made me feel seen. As if he were trying to memorize the shape of me, my presence, my mood, something he couldn't quite touch. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I got up and wandered into the hallway, drawn by the soft glow of light coming from the study. Marcus was there, sitting in his chair, reading. He looked up when I entered. "Can't sleep?" I shook my head. "Me neither," he said, setting the book down. "Come in." I hesitated at the doorway, then stepped inside. We didn't say much. I sat across from him, pulling my knees to my chest. He poured me a cup of tea and handed it to me without a word. We sat like that for nearly an hour. Sometimes he read, sometimes we just listened to the wind outside. It was the kind of silence that felt like it belonged to us. Eventually, I stood to leave. "Good night," I said softly. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Night, Elena." But as I turned to go, I felt something shift again. A pause. A wait. I stopped in the doorway, unsure why. When I glanced back, he was still watching me. Not with hunger, not with confusion, but with something far more dangerous. Longing, clean, quiet, unspoken, and I felt it in every part of me. The house was quiet again, not the peaceful kind of quiet that came with early mornings and gentle rain. This quiet was heavier, still, but not calm, like the air was holding its breath. Celeste had been gone for 2 nights now, attending a regional museum conference 2 towns over. Marcus had mentioned it just once, offhandedly, and neither of us brought it up again. But I felt the shift the minute she left. The house felt bigger, emptier, and somehow more intimate. I spent most of that first day in the studio, trying to finish a commission for a children's book illustration. I sketched, erased, and redrew the same page 5 times. Nothing felt right. My lines were too stiff, my colors too forced. By evening, I gave up. I wandered into the kitchen, half hoping to find Marcus there and half hoping not to. He was. He stood at the counter, chopping herbs with the rhythm of someone who wasn't really concentrating. The lamp above the stove cast a warm glow over the room, softening everything. "Hungry?" he asked, without looking up. "Not really," I